In this video, I'll show you how to quickly implement a grid that includes pagination controls for displaying checking account transactions using Knockout. We're going to be adding functionality for the print statement option, so let's fill in the href value here using url.action to create a URL for the statement action in the checking account controller, and we'll pass it an ID parameter whose value will be the value of the checking account ID that's already in the view bag. And then we'll add a new action in the checking account controller. So statement will take an ID parameter, the ID of the checking account, and we'll just grab that checking account from the DB set using the find method. And this time we can use our convenient transactions navigation property to quickly access all transactions for that account and pass them to the view as a list. So I've already prepared a corresponding statement view, and you can find that in the exercise files in Chapter 7 in the Start folder, and I'm just going to drag that into our checking account views folder and open it up. And you can see that it has a model directive specifying an IEnumerable of transaction. The table that will display the transactions has been assigned a few Bootstrap classes to make it a little prettier. Our transaction model is very simple, and we didn't bother with transaction dates, so I'm putting transaction ID here just so that we have at least 2 columns in the grid. In the footer of the table, we have pagination controls. Right now, they're just Bootstrap glyph icons for a left arrow and a right arrow, but we'll be binding their click events to behaviors in the view model and also displaying the current page number between them. Under the Knockout library script, I have a single helper function just to format amounts with 2 decimal places. And then I have my view model, followed by a call to apply bindings to activate it. The view model's properties are the following: an array containing all of the transactions that I want to display in the grid. This will be for the base set of transactions, not the current page's transactions. And we'll need to figure out a way to get those into my page as a JSON array. Next, we have a page size, which is the number of transactions to display on each page. Neither of these first 2 properties are going to change during the life cycle of the page, so we don't need to make them observables. Our first observable property is going to be the current page, because obviously when that changes, the grid needs to be updated, and we're initializing this to 1. By the way, if I did need to make transactions an observable, for instance, if the transactions in my grid were editable, I'd need to use ko.observableArray instead of just ko.observable. The list of current transactions will be a computed observable, since it's a subset of the base set of transactions that we calculate using the current page value. To get that subset, we just need a start index and an end index for the array, and then we can use the slice method to grab it. The start index is just the current page minus 1 multiplied by the page size. Note that since current page is an observable, we get its value by calling it like a function. The end index is just the start index plus the page size. Finally, we have 2 self-explanatory methods for moving the pager forward and backward. So from this point, all we need to do is bind properties and methods of the view model to the markup, and also produce a JSON array of transactions. But before we do that, I'm just going to add some seed data for one of my accounts so that we actually have a good number of transactions to look at. So in the exercise files, also in the Start folder under Chapter 7, there's a text file called seed data. I'm just going to copy these lines and paste them into my seed method, which is in the configuration class of the migrations folder. So whether or not there's an existing admin user, at the bottom of the seed method, I'm going to be adding a number of transactions for checking account ID 5, which is actually the checking account of the admin user. So if you're following along with your own version and you want to use this seed data, just make sure that checking account ID exists in your database. And to add these to your database, we just have to run update database from the package manager console. Okay, it looks like that worked, and let's go back to the view now. The next thing I want to do is embed my C# transaction list in the JavaScript here as a JSON array. And we can do this very easily using Razor and the JSON convert class. And this is in the Newtonsoft.json namespace. We get this through a NuGet package that was already installed with this project template. So I'm going to use JSON convert.serializeObject and just pass it my model. We're also going to need to pass it an instance of JSON serializer settings. And the reason we need to do this is to tell it to ignore the circular references that we have between transactions and checking accounts, since each entity holds a reference to the other. And we can do that just by setting reference loop handling to reference loop handling.ignore. But one problem with this approach is that by default, Razor emits HTML encoded strings, and we want to make sure that our quotes in our JSON data aren't encoded as HTML entities. To fix that, we can just wrap this with html.raw. Notice that up here in my T-body, I only have one row. That's okay, because Knockout can use that as a template if we add a data bind to the T-body with a for each and give it our computed observable current transactions. And for the cells, I want to add data bind text with ID and formatted price, passing amount to that. For my pagination controls, we can do data bind click and just give it the name of a function, previous page and next page. And remember, we also want to show the current page number here. That's another data bind text with current page. And now we're ready to take our first look. I'm going to go over to the home page since I need to make sure that I'm clicking the link that passes the ID parameter, and start up. And now when I click print statement, I see my pageable grid. One thing that we haven't addressed is what happens when a user tries to go past the last page of results or before the first page of results. I don't want anyone going to page 4 or page 0 or -1, so let's fix that. For the left arrow, it's very simple. We can just use the visible binding with a test and say that we only want this to be visible if the current page is greater than 1. The right arrow is going to take a little more work because we have to figure out which page is the last page. We can calculate that as a property of our view model, and I'll put it after the current page. And we'll just have to take the length of the transactions array and divide by the page size. But if we have a remainder, we're going to want to round up so that we have an extra page for the last few transactions. So we'll wrap this in math.ceil to get the ceiling of that number. And then we can just do the same thing with visible and test whether current page is less than last page. And let's save and refresh and take another look. And there you go. We just built a decent looking grid with client-side paging from scratch, with Knockout's help, of course.